Okay, so we are looking today at Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. Okay, so Ted Hughes was the poet laureate actually until his death in 1998. He was born in 1930, which is quite surprising because Bayonet Charge is essentially a World War I poem. He grew up in the countryside in Yorkshire, and from a very early age, he was passionate about animals and nature and would go on to become very famous for writing poetry about animals. His father actually served in World War I. William Hughes was one of only 17 soldiers in the Lancashire Fusiliers who survived death at Gallipoli. And through many of Hughes' poems, we see a picture of his father as somebody who spent the rest of his life emotionally traumatized from this experience of World War I. Ted Hughes was obsessed with World War I in the early part of his adult life. The region he was brought up in also lost a lot of its population during the war, and he also had an admiration for the poetry of Wilfred Owen, and that's quite significant. Wilfred Owen actually lived through World War I, and Ted Hughes did not, so he looked to Wilfred Owen in terms of inspiration. He did this in the form of structure as well as borrowing some kind of literary devices as well, interestingly enough. Now, in his published letters, Hughes said in quotations, "Owen, when I came to know his poems, grew to represent my father's experience." And Bayonet Charge is one of 6 poems included in Hughes' first published collection, The Hawk in the Rain, which was interestingly typed out by his wife at the time, Sylvia Plath, and then entered into a competition. Hughes won the competition and eventually became published. And Sylvia Plath was also a very famous poet, died tragically, as did Ted Hughes' first wife, but that's not contextually relevant to this poem. It's just an interesting fact. The other contextually relevant historical things about Ted Hughes are in terms of this poem. So let's have a look at the poem itself. Bayonet Charge. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw, in raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. Hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air, he lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. The patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like a molten iron from the center of his chest. In bewilderment, then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand that pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statue in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide, open silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honor, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terrors, touchy dynamite. Now, the poem is about a nameless soldier going over the top in the trenches. Soldiers would have bayonets attached to the end of their rifles and would use them to stab enemy soldiers. The nameless soldier in this poem seems to become more a weapon than a man rushing towards the enemy. And it's not clear at the end whether he dies, but there is definitely a change in him. His actions are very raw and primal, much like an animal, suddenly pausing, preparing to react. Now, it's an extremely complicated poem, this, as Ted Hughes' poems often are to analyse and interpret. Deliberate on the part of Ted Hughes, but we're going to have a go at analysing. Now, have a look at the first word of the poem. And why do you think Hughes has chosen to begin the poem in this way? We are clearly brought into some kind of action, aren't we? The reader is brought in quite physically there. Now look at the first line as well. And if you could sort of annotate it, focusing on the first word, and also he woke up, and also the connotations of the word raw. And pause here, please. Okay, so let's have a look at suddenly. This suggests that the experience happened with little warning. It shows his shock. We wonder, what has he woken up from? Was he actually asleep? Has he woken up in a metaphorical sense? Was he unaware of how extreme the experience would be on the battlefield? It suggests that he's woken up to the reality of it. And the word raw suggests something unprepared, something we're not ready for, something lacking a protective cover, something that's perhaps exposed and vulnerable. It could even suggest he is young and he's lacking experience. In all, there's a general sense in this first line that nothing can prepare a soldier for the experience on the battlefield. Now, we're going to have a look at these three phrases here, and you're going to complete a grid in the following slide with an explanation of what each phrase suggests. And I want you to try and look for more than one interpretation. If you can also have a look at these lines and name the technique used and explain why it's being used, that would be great. So if you could pause here and either screenshot or copy down these three lines, and the highlighted that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. And let's have a look at this table. So pause here, and then we'll go through it. Okay, so dazzled with rifle fire. Now, in terms of the interpretation of this creates a sense of confusion because he can't see properly. It's a very strangely beautiful image, and perhaps he's drawn to it. Is he mesmerized by it? Now, we've got personification here. It brings the battlefield alive, as if the battle itself is the enemy, not individual soldiers. And smacking the belly out of the air. Now this creates the sound of the bullets, doesn't it? Violent and forceful, suggests being winded by them. He adds an odd juvenile connotation, something children do when swimming or play fighting. Is he perhaps a youthful soldier? So here we've got onomatopoeia, which again brings the battlefield to life, and it helps create this sensory confusion that soldiers were subjected to. And again, that's the beauty of Ted Hughes's poets. We're quite confused as the reader, and perhaps by doing this, he is trying to illustrate exactly this confusion. It's bringing us into the confusion of the soldier's world. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. Now this makes the rifle sound part of him, doesn't it? Like an extra limb, but it feels useless in this moment because it's numb. And the word lugged also suggests an effort to carry because it's heavy, and it shows his reluctance to use this. And this obviously is a simile, and it's compared to an injured body part, and it emphasizes the risks that this experience exposes to him. Okay, so let's have a look at this first stanza here. Now, I want you to have a look at the punctuation and enjambment here. How does this help to establish how the poem is read aloud? And how should these lines be read aloud? What feeling should be injected into the tone of voice? So pause here. So in terms of the enjambment, this draws attention to the word raw, which is associated with the physical discomfort. It could be a reference to extreme emotional response. And we've also got links to youth and ignorance of the soldier until that moment. And the commas build a list of activities, this, then this, then this. It creates a sense of pace and drama here. And the dashes as well could show his momentary pauses as he tries to orientate himself in the confusion. And I think that this should be read with a sense of urgency and drama, showing kind of the panic. Okay, so we'll move on for a part two.